This is Cavendish Square in the West End of London, just behind Oxford Street. It was here that one evening in the spring of 1894, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson stepped down from a hansom cab on the way to Holmes's old flat, 221B, Baker Street. Holmes carefully surveyed the square. He knew that one of the old Moriarty gang was out to kill him, and he wanted to make sure that they hadn't been followed. Once he was satisfied, they started to walk west, across Cavendish Square, and into what is now Henrietta Place. We can't follow them exactly because the modern streets are different from what they were in 1894, but Watson says that they passed rapidly and with an assured step through a network of mews, which must have brought them out into Marylebone Lane. The mews are long gone, of course, so I've walked the length of Henrietta Place to arrive at this junction with Marylebone Lane. Here's another view of Marylebone Lane. Holmes and Watson would have entered somewhere around here, with Holmes looking right and left, still making sure they weren't being followed. They then would have turned right, and Holmes would have led Watson towards Wigmore Street, which is just coming up in our picture now. Here they could have turned left and gone straight to Baker Street, but instead they crossed Wigmore Street and continued along Marylebone Lane. At the end of Marylebone Lane, Holmes and Watson came to Bentinck Street, and you can see the junction in this picture. At that corner they turned left and started to head westwards. Watson says he didn't realise they were making for Baker Street, and it's not surprising, because it was a very odd route. At the end of Bentinck Street they crossed Thayer Street and into what Watson calls a short street of gloomy houses. This must have been Hines Street, though the houses are much less gloomy nowadays, and they entered Manchester Square. Apart from all the cars, I suspect that Manchester Square must look pretty much the same today as it did when Holmes and Watson arrived there on that spring evening in 1894. The square is famous, of course, for Hertford House, which houses the Wallace collection. As they entered the square, Holmes and Watson would have turned right and headed towards Hertford House. I'm following exactly the same route, and here we are, walking past Hertford House now. This brings us to the first street that Watson actually mentions in his account, that is, Manchester Street. Manchester Street runs north out of Manchester Square, so Holmes and Watson turned right and walked along the side of Hertford House until they came to George Street. Again they could have turned left up George Street and arrived immediately at Baker Street, but they didn't. They crossed George Street and continued along Manchester Street until they arrived at Blandford Street. We know this because Blandford Street is the second one that Watson actually mentions in his account. So on reaching Blandford Street they must have turned left and then headed up towards Baker Street, though Watson says he still didn't know that that's where they were going. They walked up Blandford Street, and according to what follows next in Watson's account, Holmes suddenly turned and darted down a narrow alley. The alley was almost certainly this one. Once in it, Holmes led the way into the backyard of a house, and then into the house itself, and it was then that Watson realised they were in Baker Street. This is the junction of Blandford Street and Baker Street, but where was 221B? Was it in this direction, going north towards Baker Street Underground Station? Or was it this way, going south towards Portman Square and Oxford Street? Having followed all the clues, I know exactly where it was, but I'm not going to tell you. You'll have to buy my book, Sherlock Holmes's London.